Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for your patience and welcome to our webinar titled Decoding 21 CFR Part 11, presented by Sally Miranker, who heads up Perficient's Computer Systems Validation Group. My name is Eugene Safanov. I'm the Marketing Manager for the Life Sciences practice at Perficient. Before I turn it over to Sally, I'd like to cover some basic housekeeping items and then provide a brief overview of our company. So all of our participants on this call will be in a listen-only mode, which means that everyone is on mute. You can submit questions to the speaker at any time today by typing them in the chat feature, which is located on the left side of your screen. Please do make sure you state your questions clearly and keep in mind that other webinar participants will not see them. Your questions to the speakers will be anonymously addressed as time allows towards the end of the presentation. But if you still have unanswered questions, feel free to reach out to us via the contact information that will be provided throughout the slides. You are also welcome to fill out the contact forms found on Perficient's website. Please note that today's webinar is being recorded and will be sent to you within several days. A link to the slides will also be included. All right, now that we've covered the logistics, let's move on to a quick overview of our company. Perficient is an IT consulting company that offers a whole host of IT solutions for a variety of industries, including, of course, life sciences, as well as healthcare, financial services, consumer products, and a couple of others. We have employees and offices all over the world, including the locations you see on this slide here. And as you may expect, most of our clients are based in North America and Europe. Next slide, please. This slide here contains a bunch of facts. Just to point out a few, we were founded in 1997. We're a publicly traded company on the NASDAQ. And lastly, at the moment, we have a little over 2,500 employees. Next slide, please. We offer our clients many different types of business and technology solutions, from business process management and information management to content management systems and portals. We simply have a broad portfolio of solutions we work with. The solutions we provide are what you would typically expect from an IT services company, which is consulting, implementations, upgrades, cloud hosting, application support, project management, and the list goes on and on. But really when it comes down to life sciences specific IT applications, we cover the data management and EDC space. We cover the safety and pharmacovigilance area, as well as clinical trial management, data warehousing, and analytics. That said, we provide services that relate to many other areas inside a typical life sciences company. All right, now that I've covered the housekeeping items, I'd now like to pass it over to Sally.
Thanks, Eugene, and hello, everyone. As Eugene mentioned, my name is Sally Miranker, and I'm a Senior Project Manager at Perficient Life Sciences, where I head up the Computer System Validation Group. I'm responsible for overseeing system validation, SDLC, and all validation-related activities performed by Perficient Life Sciences staff. I've got about 20 years experience in the life sciences industries, and with the last 8 of those focusing on implementing regulated systems. Today's webinar was inspired by a recent Perficient blog series called the 21 CFR Part 11 Decoder Ring written by Marin Richardson, a member of our validation group. Please check it out if you haven't already. Before I get into the presentation, I need to state the disclaimer that the interpretations in this webinar are those of our validation group and should not be taken as those of the FDA. I also want to say that I know there's a lot of ways to interpret the regs. If you have a different interpretation than what we go over today, I'd be really interested in receiving those via email. I also want to apologize up front because there is a lot to cover during this webinar, and the pace is going to be kind of fast. So that being said, I will get right to it. I assume that most of you listening are associated with life sciences industry in some capacity, and I assume that you've heard the term 21 CFR Part 11. You may have figured that it's a set of regulations related to computer systems, but unless you work in some sort of compliance group, you might not understand what it's about or why it's important. The purpose of this webinar is to help decode the 21 CFR Part 11 regs, and we'll be going over the meaning of the main 21 CFR Part 11, key concepts and terms, a section-by-section review of the regs, during which I will narrow in on areas of confusion, which I'll attempt to clarify, and I'll give examples and suggestions on how to comply with the regs. Finally, at the end of the presentation, as Eugene mentioned, I will answer questions that you submit. So to start with, let's decode the term 21 CFR Part 11. CFR is short for Code of Federal Regulations. The CFR is coded, which means it uses numbers and letters and is a set of laws published in the United States Federal Register. 21 is short for Title 21. The CFR contains 50 titles in all. Title 21 applies to food and drugs. A few other titles are shown here. Part 11 of Title 21 is specific to electronic records and electronic signatures and includes electronic submissions to the FDA. The CFR is organized in order of title, chapter, subchapter, then part. But as you can see, the name 21 CFR Part 11 actually leaves out chapter and subchapter. But Part 11 of Title 21 actually falls under Chapter 1, which applies to the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, and is largely based on the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act from 1938. And incidentally, Chapters 2 and 3 of Title 21 are related to other agencies, such as the DEA, that focus on illegal drugs. Part 11 falls under Subchapter A, General of Chapter 1. So 21 CFR Part 11 regs listed here at a high level were published in 1997. Technology has drastically changed since then, but even so, companies subject to Part 11 need to follow the wording of these regs as closely as possible within the context of current technology. So I'm going to approach the Part 11 regs in order during this webinar. The first is Subpart A, General Provisions. The general provisions in Subpart A set the stage, kind of explaining the whys and the whats about Part 11 rather than the how-tos, which will come later. The regs in Subpart A consist of statements and explanations rather than describing specific requirements for electronic records or electronic signatures. So when validating a computerized system against 21 CFR Part 11, because this subpart's regs aren't really testable, this Subpart A is typically handled procedurally by companies. The first section in Subpart A is 11.1 Scope. So in this and subsequent slides, the actual language from each regulation of the FDA is on the left. and our interpretation of what that language means is on the right. And I'm not going to go through reading each of the actual regulations to you to conserve on time, but I will present our interpretation. So Subpart A, Section 11.1, Scope A, explains that the point of Part 11 is to establish the FDA's conditions for treating electronic records the same as paper records, and for treating electronic signatures the same as ink signatures. The next part, under their scope section, B, explains the types of records that apply to Part 11, which are all electronic records that are used for federally regulated purposes. One exception is made, however, that a paper record, for example, like an email attachment that's transmitted electronically, is not subject to Part 11. This would apply to something like a fax or an email that contains a scanned hand-signed document, where that hand-signed document is actually considered the official record. 11.1c says that if an organization can prove that their electronic signatures and associated electronic records comply with Part 11, the FDA will accept electronic instead of ink. However, another exception is noted, and that is if some other reg specifically requires ink, then that regulation actually takes precedence over Part 11. D reads almost the same as the last one, but is specific to electronic records versus electronic signatures and their associated records. Again, an exception is noted that if there's some other reg that actually requires paper records, then that reg supersedes Part 11. E says that proof that a system complies with 21 CFR Part 11 must be maintained in such a way that the FDA can come in and inspect it. In other words, access to the system and documentation is extremely key. There has to be clear, concise, retrievable documentation, as well as functionality demonstrated within the system that can show how the system complies with the regs and proves that it actually does comply. Documentation should be stored somewhere safe and easy to find. 11.1f lists a very few types of records that are actually excluded from Part 11. For example, if you look them up, you'll find that some electronic records related to food and drug transportation and handling are actually not required to comply. The next section in Subpart A is 11.2 implementation. These regs don't describe specific requirements that must be met for an electronic record or signature to comply with Part 11, but rather further explain which types of records are subject to Part 11. 11.2a says that for regulated records that are not submitted to the FDA, companies can use electronic records instead of paper as long as they can prove that their electronic records actually comply with Part 11. In other words, if you're submitting them to the FDA, in other words, if you're not submitting them to the FDA, as long as you can prove that your electronic records comply with Part 11, you can do away with paper. So 11.2b says that when you are submitting records to the FDA, organizations can use electronic instead of paper as long as they meet two conditions. The first condition is that the organization has to prove that their electronic records comply with Part 11. And secondly, the FDA actually has to be able to accept those types of records electronically. So the types of records of electronic records that the FDA can accept are listed in Public Docket number 92S-0251. If there's any doubt as to whether a specific type of record can be submitted electronically, you can contact the receiving unit at the FDA before attempting a submission. And if you do so, it would be a great idea to mention the public docket number. This is a continuation of the last slide, and it goes on to say that electronic documents submitted to the FDA that are not called out in that public docket won't be considered as official. In these cases, the paper documents are considered the official record and have to be sent. Again, check with the FDA if in doubt. The next section in Subpart A is 11.3 definitions. These regs, again, don't describe specific requirements that must be met for an electronic record or signature to comply with the regs, but rather define 21 CFR Part 11 terms. 11.3a says that some terms that are defined in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act also apply to Part 11. The first term in the definitions is Act, which is short for Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Agency is short for the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA. Next, the definition of biometrics is a method of using a physical attribute like a fingerprint or a retinal scan to verify someone's identity. A closed system is defined as one that's accessed is controlled by the people responsible for its contents. You may hear in other forums that a closed system is defined as an isolated system that doesn't interact with external environments, or a system that's not available over the internet. But in context of 21 CFR Part 11, don't be confused by those other options or opinions or descriptions. Keep your focus on who is ultimately responsible for and who controls access to the electronic records that are contained within a system. The next definition is digital signature. And a digital signature is a type of electronic signature that uses cryptography to verify the identity of the signer and the integrity of the record that's assigned. In case you don't know, cryptography is the enciphering and deciphering of information that is in a secret code. An electronic record is information. For example, an image, data, text, or audio that's in digital form that is used in some way by a computer system. An electronic signature is a compilation of computer data that represents a person's consent or approval of an electronic record that is as unique and as legally binding as their handwritten signature. There are several types of electronic signatures that offer different levels of control. For instance, a digital signature, the one I defined a few slides ago, falls into a subgroup of electronic signatures that provides a higher level of security because they're based on public key cryptography that can authenticate the signer's identity, the intent, data integrity, and the non-repudiation of signed documents. So the definition of handwritten signature you'd think would be pretty straightforward compared to electronic or digital signatures. But the regs indicate it as the scripted name or legal marking created by an individual that is used by that individual to authenticate something in writing. The FDA's definition puts parameters on a handwritten signatures application by indicating that the act of signing has to be done using a marking instrument, a pen or stylus or other type of instrument, on a material that will preserve the marking forever, such as paper or other material. The next definition for open system defines an open system as one that's access is not controlled by the people responsible for the system's contents. Again, like closed system, although in other forums, an open system may be defined as something like a system that is available over the internet or one that exchanges feedback with external environments. But in the context of 21 CFR Part 11 compliance, you have to focus on the FDA's definition. But you know, even so, even with that strict, keeping to the strict context of the FDA's definition, figuring out whether a system is open or closed can be pretty confusing. What does responsible for content mean, really? Is a user at a clinical site, for example, responsible for the content that they enter in a sponsor system? Who actually controls access to a hosted or cloud-based system that is subject to 21 CFR Part 11? And is a hosting provider who has administrative privileges, does that make it an open system if he's administering the access permissions? We've had several internal discussions about this because we actually are a hosting provider of systems that are subject to Part 11. Our current thinking is that an open system is one that can be accessed from outside of an organization's network where the system's access privileges, for example, user accounts, roles, groups, etc., are not controlled by the people responsible for the system's contents. And what I mean by people there, people can be either employees of the organization itself or that of a vendor that is authorized by the organization to administer the system. In Subpart B, specific requirements for electronic records or electronic signatures in computerized systems are explained. A few of them can only be met procedurally, but many are testable and should be included when validating a system against 21 CFR Part 11. Section 11.10 is the largest section and pertains to controls for closed systems, which, as you recall, are systems where access is controlled by the people responsible for the system's contents. This section begins by explaining that organizations responsible for electronic records in a system must document the procedures that they follow and the controls that they have in place for ensuring that their electronic records have the qualities of authenticity, integrity, confidentiality, and irrefutability. Those terms you'll hear kind of all the way through the regs. We interpret 11.10a to be saying that organizations responsible for electronic records in a system must validate the system to prove to itself and to auditors that the records in the system are trustworthy. In the actual reg, the first part says that validation is done to, quote, ensure accuracy, reliability, and performance. These are kind of broad system requirements that are pretty difficult to perform targeted testing on when validating a system. The qualities that, however, can be demonstrated through the validation testing of other functional or user requirements that are specified for a system. The second part of the actual FDA reg about the ability to discern invalid or altered records is pretty specific to a system's audit trail functionality and can be directly tested. So if you're validating a computer system that has audit trail functionality, a requirement could be something like the ability to view an audit trail of a record and discern what has been altered, and the inability for an audit trail record or an audit trail of a record to be changed either temporarily or permanently. Those could be tested to prove this aspect of the regulation. 10.b indicates that electronic records generated from a system must contain complete, accurate data and be in a format that humans can understand. For system validation, testable requirements for this regulation could be ability to view records within the system in human readable format, or ability to output records to an electronic file that's in human readable format, or ability for copies of records generated from the system to contain the same information as the system record itself. C says an organization has to retain electronic records and keep them safe so that they are readily available for as long as they're required to be stored. To ensure compliance with this reg, organizations should establish procedures, processes, and documented training to control things such as storage, retrieval, record retention, backup and restore of electronic records, electronic document control, and disaster recovery. 11.10b says that companies have to restrict access to people that are authorized, only to people that are authorized. To ensure compliance with this regulation, organizations should have system administration and security policies or procedures in place. In terms of system validation, possible testable requirements could be the ability for authorized users to access the system, and the converse, the inability for unauthorized users to access the system. 10.e has 3 parts. First, it indicates that a system must be able to generate a secure audit trail that shows when electronic record is created, changed, or deleted. Second, it says a change made to an electronic record should not alter the history of the electronic record. And third, says that audit trail documentation should be retained for the correct amount of time and available for viewing. The part of this regulation regarding record retention and retrieval is often handled through an organization's record retention policy or procedure. For system validation, possible testable requirements could be the ability to automatically generate an audit trail that records the date and time when an operator or an action creates, modifies, or deletes an electronic record. And the inability for an electronic records audit trail to be overwritten, deleted, or modified when the electronic record is further changed. 10.f says an organization should ensure that electronic workflows in a computer system function properly. So possible testable requirements in systems with workflow capability could be something like the ability to enforce a defined order or sequence of steps or events within the system. G talks about, it says that organizations should limit access to only authorized users and restrict a user's ability to perform functions in the system that they are authorized to perform. To ensure compliance with this reg, an organization should establish and maintain procedures or processes that govern things like system administration, logical security, and physical security. For system validation, testable requirements could be the ability for authorized users with appropriate permissions to access the system, ability for authorized users to input and output data, ability for authorized users with appropriate permissions to modify records, and finally, ability for authorized users to electronically sign a record within a system. And then also the negative tests for those, so something like the inability for people without the appropriate permissions to electronically sign a record within a system. 10.h says that devices used to input data into a computer system need to be checked to ensure they are operating correctly and that the data itself is valid. The tasks involved with checking peripheral devices and their operation typically falls outside of the scope of computer system validation testing and should be addressed procedurally by the organization that's responsible for the input device. For systems that are capable of determining whether input data is valid, some testable requirements could be ability to check the validity of device input data and the ability to display an error message when a device input data from a device is not valid. 10.I says that organizations need to ensure that the people who perform functions on or within an electronic record, electronic signature systems are qualified to do so. This reg falls outside of the scope of computer system validation. So to ensure compliance, organizations should establish and maintain procedures that address staff training and staff qualifications. 10.J says policies must be in place to hold an individual accountable for the integrity of their actions related to electronic records and electronic signatures. This reg falls outside of the scope of computer validation. But to ensure compliance, organizations should establish policies and procedures that control things like application of electronic signatures, controlled docs, and employee misconduct, which could actually be addressed in an organization's employee handbook, for example. 10.K indicates that organizations need to control documents that are related to a system's operation and maintenance, and that the complete history of changes that are made to those documents is preserved. So to comply with this reg, companies should establish and maintain procedures or processes that govern things such as system administration and logical security, physical security, controlled documents, and change control. Phew, that was a big one, 11 subsections. The most important takeaway is that you have to have procedures and controls for those regulations clearly documented and available for inspection. This next section, 11.30, is short, but maybe not all that sweet. So remember that in the context of 21 CFR Part 11, an open system is defined as a computer system that's access is not controlled by the same people who are responsible for its contents. 11.30 is saying that when an organization doesn't control the access to a system containing electronic records they're responsible for, to account for not being able to control access, the organization needs to take extra measures. For example, using cryptography or protocols or things like that to ensure their records' authenticity, integrity, confidentiality, and irrefutability as appropriate. The regulations in the next section, 11.50, are about the appearance of signatures that are applied to electronic records. 11.50a says when an electronic record is signed, the record must contain information associated with its signing that clearly indicates the printed name of the signer, the date and time of signature, and the meaning of signature. We've seen cases where systems with e-signature capabilities don't clearly display some of the required information directly within the signed electronic record. For example, an electronically signed record might clearly indicate the date and time and the meaning of the signature, but only display the user ID of the signer rather than the signer's name. So in order to obtain the signer's name, the ID has to be used to trace back to the signer's printed name. But even though getting to the required information in that example was a little convoluted, it still could be seen as complying with the regulation because the signed electronic record did contain information that was used to obtain a clear indication of the printed signer, the signer's printed name. 11.50b says that the items in A on the previous slide, the bullets, are subject to the same controls for electronic records and must be in human readable format. But this one brings up an example that I'd like to share with you. We recently validated a digital signature solution that we now use to sign controlled documents. We validated that the system does provide the ability to identify and view the meaning of signature, but in practice, we ultimately decided to include the meaning of signature in the document's signature block itself rather than employing the functionality that was available in the system. For us, the system offered actually too many meanings for the signers to choose from, and we were going to have a hard time controlling what people were selecting. So we decided to control the meaning of signature through our controlled document SOP. So at this point, I just want to point out that organizations should weigh out all options when determining the type of controls to use in order to comply with regulations. Sometimes the system's functionality may actually not be what you want it to be, and so you'll end up using your procedures to control them. The next section, 11.70, deals with regulations for linking signatures to electronic records. This section says that a signature executed with wet ink or electronically to an electronic record must remain connected to that record forever. It shouldn't be removed, covered over, erased, or transferred. To ensure compliance with this reg, organizations should establish and maintain procedures that govern the linking of signatures that are executed on electronic records to their respective electronic records. For system validation, testable requirements for this reg could be the ability to link an electronic signature that's executed on an electronic record to that electronic record that was signed, and the inability to remove a link between electronically signed records from the signature from the record. The regulations in Subpart C apply to organizations using systems that employ electronic signatures. So systems that don't use electronic signatures don't require compliance, and therefore this subpart is outside the scope of that type of system. Organizations that do use systems that execute electronic signatures have to comply with Subpart C, electronic signatures, 11.100, general requirements. 11.100A says that organizations utilizing electronic signatures should ensure that each signer has a unique electronic signature and that their electronic signature cannot be used by anyone else. An organization should have procedures in place that prohibit the reassignment of a user identification component or credentials to another user. For validation, a testable requirement could be inability to assign the same combination of username and password to more than one individual. 100B says that before allowing a person to use electronic signature, an organization has to first verify the identity of that person. This reg falls outside of the scope of validation. So to ensure compliance, organizations should have processes in place to verify the identity of individuals that they plan on assigning electronic signatures to. 100C says that before an organization starts using electronic signatures, it has to notify the FDA and state that they will consider electronic signatures to be as legally binding as ink signatures. To ensure compliance with this regulation, companies wishing to use electronic signatures must provide the FDA with an electronic signature certification statement. C1 describes the first step in the notification process, which is to write this electronic signature certificate statement, and which is signed in ink and mailed to the FDA at the address listed in the regulation. C2 says that if the FDA asks for extra proof that the organization is going to consider electronic signatures to be legally binding, the organization has to provide that extra information. The general requirements for electronic signatures that we just went over are fairly straightforward, although they are discussed in what seems like the opposite order. So, because logically, step one would be to notify the FDA that you're switching to electronic signatures. After that, you would verify the individual's identity that you were going to assign electronic signature to, and then assign those folks the unique electronic signature. The regulations in the next section, 11.200, are related to controls placed on electronic signature components. 200A1 states that electronic signature is not based on biometrics, such as a fingerprint or retinal scan, have to use two distinct identification components. For example, user ID and password for the signer. 200A1I says that when executing electronic signatures, the first time a user executes an electronic signature after logging on to a system, the user has to enter all of their signature components, for example, like user ID and password. But then it goes on to say that when a user executes subsequent signings during that same session, the user only has to enter one of their signature components, or at least one of their signature components. 11200A12 stipulates that the clock restarts if the signer gets logged out. In other words, the signer will have to enter all of their credentials again. So 200A2 is simple enough. It states that electronic signatures must only be used by the individuals they're assigned to. But A3, in my opinion, is kind of confusing. It says that electronic signatures should be set up so that it would take two or more people acting together to attempt to use someone else's signature. But depending how you read it or interpret it, it could sound like it directly contradicts A2 by condoning that two or more people attempting to use someone else's signature. Because more than once this regulation has caused confusion internally, I sent the FDA an email asking for clarification regarding the intent of this regulation. And actually the very next day, a response arrived from the FDA, Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, in which they confirmed unofficially that the regulation does not allow anyone but the genuine user to use his or her signature, and said that A3 explains that the system should be administered and executed such that any attempts to use another individual's signature in violation of A2 would require collaboration of two or more people. So there you have it. And I have to say, I was pretty surprised, actually astonished, at the speedy and clear reply from such a large bureaucracy. I actually have provided the email address on the final slide of this slide deck if any of you want to submit your own questions. It was not painful at all. Anyhow, to comply with these regulations, organizations utilizing electronic signatures should establish and maintain policies or procedures that employee verification processes, system administration, and logical security. Also, companies should consider distributing electronic signatures to users in such a way that at least one of the user's unique ID components is known only by the user. For example, users should be forced to change their password upon initial login. 200B says that electronic signatures that are based on biometrics can only be used by the individuals that they're assigned to. Policies and procedures that I had listed on the previous slide still could apply here. For validation, testable requirements could be ability to administer biometric identification components to users who execute electronic signatures and the inability to assign the same biometric identification component to multiple users. So the regs in the final section, 11.300, pertain to controls for user ID components. 300 starts by stating that organizations using electronic signatures should employ controls over user ID codes. Goes on to say in A that controls should ensure that no two users have the same combination of user ID and password. Each combination has to be unique. This actually is very similar to Regulation 11.100A. And for system validation, the same requirement could be used, which was inability to assign the same combination of username and password to more than one user. 300B says that passwords have to be changed periodically and should be set to expire after a set period of time. To comply with this regulation, organizations should establish policies or procedures to address password distribution and expiration. A lot of systems don't come with password aging capability, but for systems that do, a testable requirement could be ability to manage user passwords through password aging. C says that if a passcode, token, or device is lost or stolen, it must be deauthorized and replaced. This regulation is not in scope of validation, but to ensure compliance with it, organizations that use passcode token devices should maintain policies and procedures to address loss management. D says that the unauthorized use of a user's identification component must be detected and reported to the appropriate people for investigation. So to ensure compliance, organizations should maintain policies and procedures that govern password distribution and include manual processes for when systems that have electronic signature capability aren't capable of sending automatic notifications when lockouts occur. For system validation, a requirement for this reg could be inability for unauthorized users to access the system, and if the system is capable of it, ability to automatically lock a user account when the incorrect credentials have been entered a predetermined number of times for electronic signature. And also, if the system is capable, the ability to automatically notify the system admin when a user account has been locked as a result of incorrect credential entry. 300E states that passcode tokens must be tested before they're issued for use and periodically tested while they are in use to make sure they're functioning correctly. This reg is outside the scope of validation. So to ensure compliance, organizations that use passcode token devices or cards should maintain policies and procedures to address their periodic testing. So, okay, it looks like we have a few more minutes. So I'm going to go through the summary slides and then we'll wrap it up with questions. Subpart A is about general provisions and says that Part 11 applies to all electronic records that fall under FDA regulations. And if an organization can prove to an auditor that their electronic records or electronic signatures are as trustworthy as paper records and ink signatures, the FDA will accept electronic instead of paper. And the FDA will accept electronic submissions instead of paper if those submissions, first, adhere to Part 11 requirements, and second, are included among the types of documents that the FDA accepts. Subpart B is about electronic records and says organizations who use electronic records have to have procedures and controls in place to ensure the authenticity, integrity, confidentiality, and irrefutability of their records. They have to have procedures and controls in place to address things like computer system validation, record rendering, document storage, record retention, system access, audit trails, and so on and so on and so on. Systems that fall into the category of open, as defined in Subpart A, require additional measures of control. Electronic signatures must include information to indicate the printed name of the signer, the date and time of a signature, and the meaning of signature. And electronic signatures must forever be linked to their signed records. Subpart D is about electronic signatures and says that in organizations that want to use electronic signatures must inform the FDA in writing before they do so, and that each individual who will be using electronic signature has to have their identity confirmed and has to have a unique signature that never has been or never will be used by another individual. There are specific design type requirements for electronic signatures that are biometric, and the design requirements for those that are not, such as user ID and password. For electronic signatures that make use of user ID and passwords or passcodes, there are specific requirements for those passwords and passcode generating devices. So that's it. I hope you feel that invisible decoder ring on your finger now. I'll next try to answer the questions that you've submitted, but beforehand, or before I hand it over to Eugene, I want to leave you with the last slide containing my email, numbers for our sales team, and the address for submitting questions to the FDA.
Great. Thank you, Sally. Let me go ahead and put that slide up again.
Thanks.
Okay, perfect. So just to let everybody know, we have a few minutes left until we've come up to the hour. So feel free to ask your questions via the chat feature on the left side of your screen. We'll get through as many as we can. And keep in mind that we're going to ask the questions as they have been written. So if something doesn't sound super clear, that could be the reason why. So Sally, if you can follow along on the questions tab, you'll see what's been submitted, and we're going to start with the first one. The first question is, have you seen many documents using Adobe Digital Signature feature, and has it been classified, has something been classified as FDA e-signature approved? Can you comment on this, please?
I do not know much about Adobe Digital Signature itself. The system that we use is CoSign. But what I would say is if Adobe Digital Signature offers the proper types of digital signature standard things of encryption, and you get a certificate and it can be validated, then I don't see a reason why the FDA wouldn't accept it, but I don't want to speak for them. So I mean, if you are going to submit documents to the FDA, I definitely would reach out to them to ensure that what you're submitting is acceptable.
Great, thank you. Next question is, question regarding the organization that needs to inform the FDA of the intended use of e-signatures. In a CRO/sponsor relationship, who is responsible, the CRO or the study sponsor?
That is a good question. The organization that is submitting. So, I think it might depend on the agreement between the CRO and the sponsor, and who, ultimately is the one that's submitting to them. So, sorry, I don't really have a solid answer on that one, but so I guess it would be whoever it is that is responsible for submitting. Okay, sorry.
Great, thank you. Yep. Next question is, what about GAMP5? How does it fit into 21 CFR? How to combine both?
Well, so 21 CFR is specific to electronic records and electronic signatures. So, I don't know if you can elaborate maybe on what you're asking, but are you talking about SCLC and how?
Yeah, I think that's probably what you're referring to, SCLC.
Yeah. So, some systems are not even required to comply with 21 CFR Part 11. You have to do an assessment to determine whether or not your system is actually a system that is regulated or has regulated data in it. But you would still be, running your development and your implementation of systems, testing them per your own procedures. So, I guess 21 CFR Part 11 fits in if it's applicable.
Great, thank you. Next question is, regarding user accounts during the user acceptance testing of a system, is this regulated the same way, or can generic user accounts be used?
Accounts during UAT. I think you probably are asking about user access permissions and the regs that are related to that. And what in reality what I've seen is there are less controls in a non-production like a validation or testing environment on users. Like you can have test users, dummy users, or those types of things. I'm not sure if that's answering your question, but those I don't. So the thing is, you just want to be able to establish that you can control user access. And even if it is a dummy user or a generic user, the method that they use or the credentials that they enter have to show, their uniqueness and the other types of things that they have to meet for the regulations.
Great, thank you. So just due to time, we're going to ask one more question.
Okay.
Is Argus hosted by Perficient considered open or closed system for the company that contracted Perficient to host?
Right. So based on our internal interpretation of open, we consider it closed because we have an agreement with the client as we're basically administering their system, but they are, they still are in control of the content and access. So as their approved vendor with our, our agreement in place, we still fall under the closed system.
Okay, perfect, thanks. So just strictly due to time, we're going to end that short Q&A question. There are questions that were submitted. we will try to get back to you via email. As a reminder, this webinar presentation, the recording of it, will be sent to you within the next few days. And we will also submit the slides for you to review with your colleagues if you wish. As a side note, we have an upcoming webinar that discusses 3 ways to implement a clinical trial management system, so feel free to register for that on our website. Other than that, thank you so much for attending today's webinar. We all hope that you found it very helpful. Feel free to reach out to Sally or somebody else on the life sciences team via email address or by phone. Feel free to submit your questions to the FDA as well. Sally, thanks so much for presenting. That was very nice. And thank you once again, everybody.